September 17th, 1955, a little boy walks out of his grandmother's front door, jumps off of his grandmother's front porch. He's holding in his left hand a golf ball, and in his right hand, he's holding a golf club. His grandmother lives at the end of Weed Street in Augusta, Georgia, which is next door to the Augusta Country Club, not the National, where they play the Masters, but the Augusta Country Club. So all summer long, this little 4-year-old boy had been seeing golf balls in his grandmother's yard. So on this particular day, he decides that he is going to hit a golf ball into the future. So he'd been playing with his cousin Elaine, who's just 2 months older, been playing with his brother, who's 2 years younger. His mother had just given birth to his sister, and his father was away in college at South Carolina State. This little boy on this day steps off of his grandmother's front porch, and the only thing he's thinking about is to hit this golf ball as far as he can. He swings at the golf ball, and he misses. And instead, he hits a piece of glass that goes up into the air, and it falls on his left shoulder. Actually, it doesn't. It falls on his right shoulder. Actually, it doesn't. It falls on top of his head. No, it doesn't. It actually falls into his left eye. So ever since that day, that little boy, cute as he can be, has been blind on his left side. So what's that have to do with the future? One of the things that I have learned over the many years of studying the future and being acutely aware of the importance of sight is that just because you have eyesight doesn't mean that you aren't blind. In fact, what I would recognize is that people would be looking right at something and they would never see it. Think about that for just a minute. Looking right at something, people with perfectly good eyesight, but they would not see what they were seeing. The other thing I've taken from this experience is being blind doesn't mean that you won't have vision. It's one of the most interesting things. If you look back at human history, you think about people like Thomas Edison, who couldn't hear, would give us the phonograph. Or would be Beethoven, who would be able to hear, but would get the 9th century. And you could just go back through history, you find all these wonderful examples of where a person wouldn't have a particular gift or a particular sense or a particular skill, and that would be the very person who would provide insight into another way of doing something everybody else thought maybe somebody else should do. But it turns out that being blind on my left side didn't really give me a disadvantage when it came to the future, because we all share the same thing. When it comes to the future, we're all blind. Why is that? Because we don't really look at the future with our eyes. We see it with our mind. That's it. We see it with our mind. Let me give you an example. In fact, these days, you'll notice that there's a lot of research being done on something called inattentive blindness or change blindness. I remember recently looking at a video done by the Harvard faculty in which they examined the idea of a person. Just get this for a minute, okay? A person checks in at a conference. One person checks in. The person who's doing the checking in jumps down below the desk, and another person comes out. The person who is doing the checking in doesn't actually know that the person has changed. Hasn't paid really attention. You can think of another example of where you may have seen the video where people were asking for directions in a foreign country. And so the person will ask for directions. The person who somehow or another would switch off the people between asking for the directions and giving the directions. The person who has been asking for the directions doesn't know that the person has changed. We don't pay very much attention. So there are lots of examples of where we're future blind. I'll give you another example. First of all, when we think about change, and as I said, we don't see change through our eyes, it's through our mind. We have these assumptions about how change unfolds. We think it's linear. Turns out that it's not that way at all. It's logarithmic. So we have some assumptions about change that helps us to sometimes be future blind. Now, other things that happen with the future, noticing it around us. We don't listen very well. I remember when I was living in North Carolina, this would have been in the early 90s, and I'd gone into a McDonald's in Pinehurst, North Carolina, and I noticed that in the background, there was not one single person speaking English. That was a clue that something was happening with the demographics. I remember going into a KFC in Clemens, North Carolina in about 1995, and I noticed then that the burglar, the notice on the window for checking out, where you would check out your food, they had changed the sign from English to Spanish, which was suggesting that there was no money in the safe, an indication something had changed. Another way of thinking about the future that we miss sometimes, there was a clue in terms of language, demographics. I'd gone to a Taco Bell. And you know this, and what I'm really suggesting here is that there's so many different ways that the future will reveal itself to us. And I was noticing in 1996 that there was some middle-aged woman serving Taco Bells in the middle of the day. Something was happening with aging. At a Chick-fil-A in about 1998, I'm noticing that after 10 o'clock, the only young person in there is one young person. Everybody else is over age 65. Aging. There are all kinds of clues that the future will give to us, but we're not looking at them. For example, if you pay attention the next time when you're in the airport, notice how many people are using wheelchairs. Or notice the next time you go to the grocery store and you see how many parking lots, how many times the parking spaces are now for the disabled. Over time, you can see that the future reveals itself to us. So we see the future, we can look right at it, but we won't really see it because we're seeing it in our minds. We have these preconceived ideas about what things should be and how they should be. So I'll tell you an example of how Nat Irvin got the future wrong. Of course, you would expect as a futurist that I would get the future right. Well, not exactly. 1997, now I have been interviewing randomly young black people about the future, randomly for over 40 years. And I started noticing there was something changing within the black community around the mid-90s. And one afternoon at a football game, I noticed this one young kid who had a book bag, and he was keeping it a secret. Every once in a while, he'd take the book out and he'd read it at a football game. Turns out he was reading Harry Potter. But he didn't want anybody to know about it. Later on, I would find this same group of people who were hiding something about their identity. And it was an indication that something might be happening within America that would change what we would think about political leadership. So over the next few years, I tracked this group who would be reading Harry Potter, among other things. They spoke other languages. And I eventually wrote a piece called The Arrival of the Thrivals, in which I described who the first black president of the United States would be. Now you have to imagine in the 90s, somebody writing about the first black president of the United States, and I said that her name would be Shaniqua Nakata Herrera Hiawatha Washington Jones. Okay, so I got the name wrong. But I got the face right. And you get the idea. So that's an example of how I was wrong. I've got other examples too. But what about you? So here we are. We just had this major event to happen, and I can say safely that most of us did not expect that this would happen. Why? Because we believe in so much data? Is that it? Probably not. What I suspect has happened is that we were not listening to each other. We would look, but we wouldn't see. We would listen, but we wouldn't hear. This is why this is such a surprise to us. But it's not a surprise to everybody. Somebody knew this transformation was underway, and that is exactly how the future will come to us. I don't think it is a surprise. And that's one of the assumptions we have about the future, that it is hidden. What I have found is that if you just pay attention to your environment, the future will give you clues all the time. All the time. In other words, we got future pranked by the election. Some people did. But so what's a useful way of looking forward to the future as we go out to 2042? Obviously, I teach in a management program, and so I think the management lens is a useful one. And I think this statement here by Peter Drucker, looking at the relationship between technology and humans, is a great way of thinking about these next 22 to 30 years. Let me walk you through a scenario of how I think we can best be able to understand what possibly could happen. I'm going to use the term singularity, and I suspect in an audience like this, most of us already are aware of what singularities mean. But for the basis of today, I'm going to be talking about the clash of the singularities, and I'm going to be using the technical singularity. And by that, what I mean is artificial intelligence reaching a point at some point in the future. Right now the projections are it could be 2029, it could be 2042, it could be 2050, but something irreversible happens to us and our machines where they begin to become smarter than we are. Irreversible. Something, the relationship between ourselves. It wouldn't be, for example, you wouldn't say the film Her is an example, but it's not bad. You wouldn't say that Westworld is an example of the singularity, but it's not bad. But it's something like that, where we are not able to come back from this space, and the relationship between ourselves and our machines recognizes us that we are second. So that's the way to think about the technological singularity. When AI becomes really smart, the position between ourselves and it changes. Another way of thinking about it is this graph here. You probably have already seen it, where it just describes how quickly this happens. This is sort of a description of Moore's law, which everybody by now is familiar with, of how computers doubling every 18 months, reducing in size, cost, etc. And then at some point, you see this from the singularity, the folks who talk about the singularity, it takes off, and we don't know where that goes. So that's one way. And the other thing is, I would say, think about the singularity as just a metaphor. But that's not the only singularity. There's another singularity, which I suggest to you as just as powerful, and that is the American demographic singularity. And the way to think about that is when America itself changes faster than anyone had expected, which is what we are experiencing now, and what we will experience over the next 20 to 25 years. This is as powerful as a technological singularity. So we have, on the one hand, the emergence of this very powerful technology which disappears. We no longer see it. And then we have the emergence of these amazing demographic shifts within our country, which, to give you an example of what that number is, it's roughly the size of the country of Indonesia. If we were to think about minorities who we have today, people that we consider to be minorities today, when we think about race, we think about ethnicity, about 235 million people. This is the transition we're in. And so this is going to impact our elections. We just had one in 2016. We'll have another in 2020, 2024, 2028. These are profound changes. And it's not only going to affect us in terms of politics, but it will also impact us in terms of the workforce. This is not guessing. This is mathematics. So now we have the clash of the way, and is the way I'm thinking about this, in context of these two very powerful singularities. What will be the implications? Well, for one, we'll start to notice this. Oxford Press has just put out a study that says about 47% of the jobs that we now have, that we humans do, could possibly disappear, automated or completely eliminated. That could mean a lawyer, that could mean journalists, that could mean traders, that could mean call center folks. There's a great wide range of possibilities of things that we humans do that we will no longer do. 47%. Then you have the issue of, should we augment or should we replace people? Because we have these very powerful technologies. Who decides on who gets augmented? Who decides on who gets replaced? For example, should we use this artificial intelligence to decide for judges on who should get the longer sentencing in our court systems. This is not in the future. This is now. We have in the past talked about affirmative action. In the future, we'll talk about genetic affirmative action. We will introduce new terms like algorithmic justice, because algorithms, these very powerful formulas, are determining who gets hired. It is going to impact all of us. Should we use algorithms to determine public policy? Can we use algorithms to determine who is the ideal presidential candidate? And then will we use our technology to create a candidate to fit exactly that profile? These are very powerful tools. But we already know that you can't really trust our powerful tools. And so therefore, I wanted to leave you with an assignment, one of the most powerful assignments I've given my MBA students over the years. And it's this. I'm going to invite you to interview somebody who is 75 years of age or older, who is of a different race or ethnicity than you are. Find them. For my students, it's a shock. First of all, they don't know anybody over the age of 75 that's not their parents. And then they have to go find them, which means they necessarily get out of their comfort zone. They start to recognize their blindness. The second thing I'd like to invite you to do is to find a child and get on their level and see how they're looking at the world. It will remind you of the importance of imagination and creativity and seeing through their lens. In other words, I'm encouraging you to adopt the lens of someone else, to see through someone else's eyes. And then finally, I wanted to tell you about this guy. We call him the little guy. This is a picture of a little child taken in 2007 in Kenya in an area called Nakuru. My youngest son, Roman, took this picture. He had been volunteering for one of the orphanages there. Now, this child, we don't really know what his name is, but I do know this, that at some point, he is going to jump off of his grandmother's front porch. He's going to have, maybe it won't be a golf ball in his hand, it won't be a golf club in his hand, he may not have a baseball, it may not be a baseball bat, maybe it'll be a soccer ball. But he's going to put that ball down on the ground. But before he kicks it, I'd invite you, see if you can get the glass. Move the glass before he swings at it. Until the next time, I will see you in the future. Thank you.